Back off, lady. People like you don't belong past the carpet. The baton came first. Fast, practice, indifferent. Thudding into her shoulder before the words finished echoing in the cool morning air. Dr. Kiana Brooks staggered. Breath sliced out her lungs. Her briefcase spun from her hand and split open, a flock of white pages scattering across the granite steps of the courthouse. She had served for 22 years. Memos, draft orders, a docket she'd annotated at midnight. Paper snow drifting to a floor polished by promises. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Officer Colt Maddox smiled without warmth. Hands behind your back. Kiana lifted her eyes, not to his face, but to the bronze plaque bolted above the entrance. The Honorable Kiana Brooks presiding, 20 feet away for her own courtroom. Cuffed on the stone her oaths had blessed, she measured the pain like a doctor reading a chart. The second officer, Ruiz, young and tense, hovered unsure. The third, Pike, lifted his phone a fraction, hunting an angle like a tourist. Identification is in my jacket, Kiana said evenly. Sure it is, Maddox drawled. He twisted, and the cuffs bit harder. You're trespassing with stolen papers. That's what you are. I've seen the routine. Routine? She couldn't help the smallest smile. That's the problem. He pushed her toward the doors. The lobby swallowed them. Metal detector gates, fluorescent light, the antiseptic hum of a building where people learn their fate by schedule. Bailiff Asha Green glanced up, frowned, and then looked down again at the stack of motions in her hand. In plain clothes, with hair pinned up and the bruise starting like spilled ink along her jawline, Kiana was a stranger passing through a script everyone thought they knew. Courtroom 3 smelled of old varnish and paper. A substitute sat at the bench. Judge Alan Whitman, a pale man with an overstarched collar and a docket borrowed at dawn. Aaron Vale, assistant district attorney, stood at counsel table with a pencil clipped behind one ear and the confident boredom of someone who expected everything to rhyme with what she'd seen yesterday. They seated Kiana at the defendant's table. The gallery rustled. Clerks, public defenders, a couple of perfumed jurors waiting to be assigned, a teenager on a field trip hugging her backpack with both arms. It looked different from this low angle. The seal over the bench a crest of power instead of the ceiling rose. She watched Bailiff Green write her name, hesitate, then strike it out to replace it with Jane Dioe. Call the matter, Whitman said, settling. The state versus... Vale glanced at the paper Maddox had scrawled. Now, Naomi? No, Naomi crossed out. Jane Doe, your honor. Not my name, Kiana said. The cuffs made her voice sound like it had to turn corners to reach the room. Officer Maddox, Whitman prompted. State the basis for arrest. Maddox stood, with a certain swagger people put on when they step into a lie they have worn many times. At approximately 8:49 a.m., I observed the defendant loitering near the secure entrance. She was dressed inappropriately for court, carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. Upon request for identification, she became agitated, used profanity, and attempted to push past security. I applied minimal force to restrain her and prevent a security breach. Minimal? Kiana asked, more to herself than to him. Any video evidence? Judge Whitman asked without much hope. Partial, Maddox said. My body cam malfunctioned. He didn't need to credibly sell it. He only needed the room to nod. The room was used in nodding. Officer Ruiz cleared her throat, then swallowed the sound. Officer Pike stared at the floor with the intense concentration of a man counting tiles. ADA Vale shuffled, pleased at the tidy alignment. Standard counts, your honor, trespass, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and attempted assault on a police officer. A law clerk in the back row, Tessa Lynn, sleep bruise under her eyes, tapped her pen and tilted her head, trying to name why the air felt wrong. The woman at the table didn't carry panic the way most defendants did. She carried stillness, a tight, level stillness like the flat surface of a lake with a current under it. Judge Whitman peered over his glasses. Defendant! Ah, Doe, do you wish to be heard before I set conditions? Kiana stood. The chains between the cuffs gave a single dry clink that carried clear to the back row. She met Whitman's eyes and spoke in a tone not raised and not deferential, simply placing the room, firm as furniture. Yes, Your Honor. I request an immediate preservation order for the entrance and stairwell cameras covering 8:45 to 9:10 a.m., with mirrored downloads to the county's off-site archive. I further request preservation of all body-worn camera data from Officers Maddox, Ruiz, and Pike, including the automatic 60-second cloud backups. Finally, I ask that the documents in State's Exhibit A be opened and their provenance verified. The pencil stopped. Even the HVAC seemed to listen. Vale laughed once, a small sharp sound. Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to litigate discovery from the dock. Kiana kept her gaze on the bench. I am attempting to prevent the deletion of exculpatory evidence. Brady doesn't begin after the damage is done. Whitman blinked. There was again that cadence, the exactness of someone who had not just read rules but applied them until they were muscle. He wasn't sure he liked being pushed, but he recognized the push. Preservation order granted, he said, and the room shifted a fraction, like a boat adjusting weight. Bailiff Green, Cedarwood Security and IT are notified. We will recess for 15 minutes. Maddox's smile thinned into a line that could cut. 15's plenty, he murmured. Kiana lowered herself to the chair. Her shoulder throbbed in rhythmic pulses, a drumbeat she would not let set the tempo. Tessa Lynn wrote a name in the margin of her legal pad, Brooks, then shook her head as if to clean a window. In the anteroom, Bailiff Green unlocked the cuffs with fingers that had begun to tremble. Up close, the bruise along Kiana's jaw read like a sentence someone else had written on her face. Do I know you? Green asked, the question small in her throat. You've walked me to chambers every morning for the last 8 years, Kiana said gently. She watched the recognition cross the woman's face like weather moving across a plain. First wind, then rain, then the clear stab of sun. Oh my God, Green breathed, and then corrected herself through training, through shock, into form. Your Honor. It's all right, Asha, Kiana said. We'll do this properly. 2 calls. Chief Judge Miriam Okoye. Tell her to lock and mirror the morning's footage. Then IT, body cam backups to the third-party cloud. No overwrites, no delays. And Asha, she softened, go to my chambers, the robe with the braided gold trim. And the gavel. Green swallowed, nodded once, and moved like purpose had taken her hand. Kiana's phone buzzed on the metal table. Jonah Park, her clerk. Where are you? The King of Raymond is paging. Rumors everywhere. She typed back with her non-cuffed hand. Reschedule the morning. Hold the afternoon. We're going to need it. She caught a reflection in the dark window of a locked case. Hairpins tilted, bruise gathering color. Eyes refusing to lower. She watched herself breathe until the breath obeyed. 15 minutes is long enough for a narrative to learn it is no longer the only one in the room. When they filed back, the gallery was louder, then hushed. At the top of the aisle, Bailiff Green squared her shoulders and let the words come out like a bell. All rise. They did, by habit, and then stayed risen by understanding. The doors opened. Judge Kiana Brooks walked in wearing black robes that felt her shoes like night and a gavel that fit her hand through administrations that had died and regrown. The bruise on her cheek had not been invited to leave. It stayed a witness. Whitman stepped aside without prompting, his eyes suddenly as careful as a man holding glass. Vale went white down to her knuckles. Maddox's jaw worked. Ruiz's mouth fell open. Pike didn't move at all. Kiana took the bench that already knew her weight and said not loudly, You may be seated. Power is not a shout. It is a room acknowledging where it lives. She set the gavel down. Officer Maddox remained standing, she said, and he did, as if strings had him. Counsel, retrieve Exhibit A, she added to Vale, and the prosecutor fumbled, tearing the evidence bag with a sound like paper deciding to be honest. On the top page, a seal. Chambers of the Honorable Kiana Brooks, Daily Docket. Beneath it, the memorandum she drafted Sunday night, the orders with her annotations, a letter to the public defender's office about a sentencing protocol. Vale's mouth opened, and then remembered it did not have to. Kiana looked at the monitor. Play security camera 7, she said. The screen bloomed. The steps 8:48 a.m. Her approach, Maddox's interception, the blow, casual as punctuation, the shuffle to wall, the cuffs, the slow, ugly laughter, the audio, a hiss of contempt. People like you. That made 2 jurors in the back row flinch as if the air had cracked. Minimal force? She asked him without turning her head. Maddox's neck flushed red, then gray. He said nothing. Body cam mirror backup. Device ending in 329. Kiana told the clerk. Another angle. His chest, his breath, his voice in the unguarded register men use when they think the room belongs to them. Officer Ruiz, Kiana said, her gaze cutting to young woman. You corroborated his statement. Would you like to amend? Ruiz's throat worked. Yes, Your Honor. Were you mistaken? Kiana said. Or did you lie? Ruiz's shoulders shook once, like a held-back cry moving through muscle. I lied, she said, and the room heard the words land where they belonged. Under oath, Kiana said. Perjury. Count 1. Officer Pike. Did you record on a personal device? Pike finally looked up, eyes watery. Yes, Your Honor. Did you file it? No. Failure to report. Contempt. Count 1. She looked at Maddox. As for you, assault on a judicial officer, perjury, and deprivation of rights under color law. She let the list hang, heavy as wet cloth. Remove your badge and weapon. The badge at the table with the sound of a coin dropped into a well you cannot see the bottom of. The room breathed for the first time all morning. The gavel came down once, not as thunder but as calibration. Court will recess, Judge Kiana Brooks said, and then we will begin. Word moved through the courthouse like water seeking low ground, filling every corridor and break room with the shape of what had happened. By the time they reconvened, the back rows were crowded with faces from other floors. Clerks with powdered sugar on their sleeves from a donut they'd forgotten to finish. Public defenders with ties halfway loosened. Prosecutors who stood at the walls, as if the paint might argue back. A grandmother in a church hat quietly clutching a folded letter she never thought would matter to anyone but God. Kiana sat the bench she had earned before some in the room had learned to drive, and lifted a folder already thick with the morning's new life. Let the record reflect the presence of Internal Affairs Director Vera Gage and representatives of the U.S. Attorney's Civil Rights Section, she said. Chief Judge Okoye took a seat in the front row, with a pen she didn't plan to use unless someone forgot themselves. First, Kiana said, the state's case against the person you styled Jane Doe is dismissed with prejudice. She looked at Vale, who managed a single nod, a professional swallowing pin to a private reckoning. Second, we will address sworn testimony given this morning. Officer Ruiz sat very straight. Fingers laced so tightly the knuckles shone like stones polished by river. Pike's hands were open in his lap, as if he had arrived at the end of the story he didn't like but couldn't edit. Officer Ruiz, Kiana said, voice even, you have acknowledged lying under oath. You will be held for arraignment on perjury. Your cooperation with federal authorities will be considered in sentencing recommendations. Yes, Your Honor, Ruiz said, and her voice sounded like something breaking that needed to break. Officer Pike, Kiana continued, contempt for failure to report. You'll meet Internal Affairs this afternoon. If you have anything that can be used to repair what was done in other cases, bring it. There's a difference between regret and repair. Pick the second. Pike swallowed like a man deciding whether to learn a new language at 40. Yes, Your Honor. She turned to Maddox. He stared at the crown molding like it could translate. Officer Maddox, you're remanded without bond. Internal Affairs will take custody. He flinched as the bailiff touched his elbow, the gesture no rougher than he had been to her on the steps. He flinched anyway, the body learning what the mind refused. Director Gage, Kiana said, gesturing. Vera Gage stood with the competence of a person who had learned to say no to mayors when needed. Internal Affairs has initiated a preliminary review of Officer Maddox's complaint history, use of force reports, and sustained disciplinary actions. She let the word hang and then trimmed it, or rather, the lack thereof. We recommend immediate suspension without pay, refer to post for decertification, and parallel criminal investigation. So ordered, Kiana said. The pen in Chief Judge Okoye's hand made a small note. Post, as if even formality deserves a witness. Kiana lifted another folder, thicker, heavier, a stack of names like stones gathered from a river, where people have been told to hold their breath. We will also create a conviction integrity docket, she said, and the public defenders lifted their heads in unison as if a chord had been struck. Every case in which Maddox provided material testimony in the last 5 years will be audited. Any conviction reliant on his uncorroborated account will be slated for review. Vale felt something uncomfortable. Relief press up against the inside of her ribs. The state will stipulate where appropriate, she said, and the gallery heard it for what it was. A prosecutor telling the truth out loud when the room could hear her. A young man 3 rows back, Caleb Price, shackled at the ankles for a violation hearing scheduled before all of this happened, leaned forward. He met Kiana's eye and sat back quickly, as if he'd touched the stove and found it was "You may proceed." Finally, Kiana said, "This court issues a standing order. Claim body cam malfunctions, trigger immediate forensic analysis. All footage must mirror the third-party cloud within 60 seconds. Complaint history summarized and furnish the bench in any proceeding where credibility is a live issue. Policy is not a vibe. It is a document other people can read." A laugh cracked the solemnity from someone who didn't mean to. Even reverence needs to breathe. They broke for lunch and did not eat. The afternoon became triage and architecture. Conference rooms humming with maps of cases and red string logic, without the string, only spreadsheets and linked folders and the caffeinated patience of lawyers who believe, maybe for the first time since law school, that what they were doing might make a measurable difference to something other than their billable hours. Kiana moved through it like a conductor, not dragging anyone along, but setting a tempo they could hold. Chief Judge Okoye commandeered a copier with a kind of royal efficiency that made an intern step out of the way without understanding why. Director Gage secured a warrant for Maddox's phone. The U.S. Attorney's team drafted an initial complaint that read like a door being taken off its hinges. Late afternoon, they reconvened. The gallery had swapped by half. Word raced to the street and back again. And now, there were mothers in church hats, a couple of law students with hair in messy buns and highlighters like talismans, a man in a mechanic's jumpsuit who stood with his cap in his hands, as if in his own church. On the aisle, a teenage girl in a school uniform gripped a notebook, like it might need her to hold it steady. "Next matter," Kiana said. Bailiff Green brought her a file stamped 2009, complaint unsubstantiated. The name at the top, Rosa Villalobos. "Ms. Villalobos," Kiana said, and the woman stood with a dignity that did not request permission. "You filed this complaint 13 years ago. It was dismissed. I am reopening it. Director Gage will meet you today." Rosa nodded once, and then twice, the second nod breaking into a tremble that moved from her chin to her hands to the paper she kept folded like a letter from someone she loved. "Thank you, Judge," she said, and it mattered that she said Judge, because the word had been cheapened by the morning and then made new again. A public defender stepped forward. "Your Honor, State versus Price." The conviction relied entirely on Maddox's testimony. The body cam backup, recovered this morning, contradicts the entire narrative. Kiana looked to Vale, and Vale, to her credit, did not waste anyone's oxygen. "We stipulate." "Conviction vacated," Kiana said, and the sound that moved through the room wasn't cheering. It was like a large animal exhaling after holding very still for a long time. They took the shackles off Caleb Price with a gentleness that made him blink like light had changed. In the evening, alone in chambers, Kiana laid the robe across a chair back and touched the bruise with a fingertip. Pain has an ego. It wants to be the subject of the story. She would not let it. She scrolled to a photo. Her father in a brown suit, standing outside a polling place with a first-time voter sticker, because some firsts happened too late, but still arrive. He had not lived to see her bench. She imagined him reading the day in the paper and saying nothing at all, just nodding like maybe the world had tilted a degree back toward fair. Threat emails arrived. She did not feed them. Union spokespeople invoked safety with the solemnity of men who had bet their pensions on avoidance. A morning radio host nicknamed her Queen Gavel and tried to make her the point, because a woman in a story is easier to argue with than a spreadsheet full of numbers and the lives they represent. She answered with orders, not interviews. Numbers, not adjectives. Hearings, not hashtags. A system that had decided long ago to shrug at its own reflection was being offered a mirror that did not blink. In quieter hours, she wrote. Training modules, not glossy decks. Constitutional policing as muscle memory, bias interruption for supervisors, credibility and data. How to test a story without hating a person. She wrote, and then assigned, and then track compliance like a person who had cleaned enough kitchen floors to know where grease hides. By month's end, the conviction integrity docket sat every Tuesday and Thursday like a weather pattern. Not all cases toppled. Some stood up straight under fresh light, and it was important that the room learn that the goal was accuracy, not a scoreboard. The win was the process. Meanwhile, in a different building where doors clanged shut with displeased finality, Colt Maddox learned the geography of power from the wrong side of the line. He learned that a man checking on him through a narrow rectangle does not lower his voice when he says your name. He learned how time can turn into soup and then into stone. Next matter, Kiana said on a rain pail Thursday, and the court adjusted. That phrase had become both drumbeat and prayer. Maddox's trial arrived with thickness in the air usually reserved for storms. The courthouse had learned not to perform. Cameras stayed outside. Inside, the gallery held a sober arrangement of civil society doing its work on a weekday. No banners, no chants. Only seats full and the quiet scratch of pens. The state did not put on a pageant. ADA Vale, whose posture had changed in the months since the morning's arrogance broke like a tooth, presented exactly what the law requires and nothing extra. The security footage, the body cam backups, the transcript of the false testimony, statistics marked by provenance, not flair. Internal Affairs Director Gage testified like a carpenter describing a joint. Angles, load, failure points. Chief Judge Okoye took the stand in limited scope to authenticate administrative procedures. Her answers clipped into clean pieces. Every one of them a nail where a nail belonged. Defense counsel tried. He asked whether a bruise can be misinterpreted. He suggested that people like you might have meant people without proper ID. The jury didn't look at him when he said it, which is how you know a line has set your case back a mile. He floated qualified immunity, like a raft in a courtroom where it didn't apply. He tried to shift the conversation to politics. The judge in this case, Honorable Peter Dillon, a colleague Kiana respected and who respected her by keeping his distance from this bench, kept it in law. When Kiana testified, she did it in a voice that refused theatricality the way a body refuses a transplant from the wrong blood type. She described the steps, the strike, the words, the request for preservation, the reveal, the policies that followed. She did not preach. She answered questions like stones placed in a row across a creek, so others could cross without getting their ankles wet. On day 4, the defense called Ruiz and Pike. Ruiz looked 10 years older and 10 pounds lighter. She did not attempt to salvage herself with adjectives. I lied, she said again, and did not offer a childhood or a mortgage payment or a culture to carry it. Only the act and the truth. Pike said he had filmed and not filed because Senior had laughed when he tried a year ago on a different case and told him to let the adults do the paperwork. He used a phrase like it hurt his teeth. A juror in the front row made a tiny sound a person makes when they recognize a story that was never supposed to be theirs. Closing arguments came like an exhale the room forgot it needed. Vale stood with no notes. Accountability, she said, is not an insult to good officers. It is their protection. You are not condemning a profession. You are naming a man's choices and the harm those choices produced. Defense counsel invoked fear, and the room smelled it. The verdict did not take long. Guilty on assault of a judicial officer. Guilty on perjury. Guilty on deprivation of rights under color of law. A hush broke into a murmur that carried no triumph. Only a complicated relief, like stitches that will itch but hold. Sentencing arrived a month later, with impact statements the room deserved to hear. Rosa Villalobos spoke of the July hood too hot to breathe against. Caleb Price spoke of birthdays missed, and a son who had learned how to count by tallying visits. A nurse named Geneva Nash described the way a bruise blooms in 3 shades and how long it takes to fade when you have to wear a uniform and pretend it doesn't hurt. Judge Dillon, who had run a tight trial without performative sternness, spoke softly. Deterrence is not only a word we use on people who steal televisions, he said. It must mean something here, too. He pronounced a sentence that added up to decades. No one clapped. The sound was paperwork beginning. Bailiffs moving, pens scraping. A family in the third row exhaling into a small ring of arms. Outside, microphones looked hungry. Inside, the court continued. The conviction integrity docket, motions granted and denied, training log signed and audited, a discipline matrix installed like a spine. You could hear the building learn to hold itself differently. There was pushback, always. A memo leaked, and the comments section went septic. An officer on leave posted a selfie in sunglasses that said more than the caption intended. A council member tried to turn a funding vote into a culture war. And yet, body cam compliance ticked up to 99%. Complaint review times collapsed from 6 months to 6 weeks. A dozen officers self-reported minor violations before a supervisor had to. And in a meeting no one filmed, the union had closed the door and asked Kiana, with a gruffness that barely hid relief, for help rewriting the early warning system so it actually warned instead of cataloged. The day the Integrity Review Unit cleared its first batch of cases that didn't belong on the docket, clean arrests, honest reports, Kiana made sure the officers received letters that said so. Accountability is not only a hammer. Sometimes it is a measuring tape people can trust. At a law school lecture, she almost declined because of her hearings to run, and she had no appetite for applause. A student asked the question people ask when they want to borrow someone else's courage. How did you keep your composure? Kiana smiled the way you smile at a new associate who is about to learn billing. I didn't, she said. I kept my purpose. The room wrote it down like a statute. Her father's picture stayed on the corner of her desk, turned inward so it was for her and not the office. When she finally told her mother the whole story, every blow, every order, every number, the older woman sat very still for a very long time and then said, "You put it back where it goes," in a tone that had balanced checkbooks through recessions. 6 months later, the board voted to rename Courtroom 3 not for a person, but for a promise. Forum for Integrity. The plaque was small enough not to grandstand and large enough to read from the last row if you squinted. Below the title, a list of case numbers vacated by the review, rotated every quarter. Not names. Dignity doesn't need a directory. But the numbers told an honest story to anyone who had ever had one assigned to them. By then, you could hear the difference in the building's sound. Less paper shuffling to delay, more to decide. Less throat clearing, under lies. More chairs scraping as people stood when they didn't used to correct something before it calcified. When Asha Green announced all rise, people stood a shade straighter. Ritual, redeemed, can do that. Maddox filed appeals, as was his right. They moved through the system with the dignity owed even to men who had tried to deny it to others. He learned the slow physics of consequence. He lifted weights in a yard where the sky is a painting you cannot touch. He discovered that memories have edges, and you can cut yourself on them even when you're sitting very still. Kiana kept her calendar calm and her rulings short. She read everything. She had opinions, and she wrote them as if the losing side might still be invited to her table. You do not change a culture with speeches. You change it with memos that are read because they are clear and policies that are followed because they work. On an ordinary Tuesday, which is exactly when justice should arrive, a case came up where the arresting officer had done everything right, had de-escalated, had reported his own small error before anyone asked. Kiana said, so on the record. Defense counsel nodded. ADA Vale nodded. The officer blushed, which is a color you want to see in a courtroom from time to time. It means someone remembers their own size. Outside, nothing dramatic happened. Inside, everything ordinary did. And that is how you know a place is healing, not by fireworks, but by the habit of getting it right without asking for a parade. The morning the courthouse dedicated a modest bronze plaque near the entrance, the air smelled like warm stone and coffee. The words were simple. Here, on these steps, a lie was stopped. Here, inside these walls, a system chose to learn. There was no ribbon. Chief Judge Okoye spoke for exactly 90 seconds about procedures with dates and verbs. Director Gage thanked a handful of analysts by name. ADA Vale read the first public report of the Integrity Review Unit out loud. 57 cases reopened. 26 vacated. 9 remanded for new trial. 22 affirmed. Numbers as ritual, numbers as apology, numbers as spine. Kiana did not speak. She walked the steps after the crowd drifted to their desks, running her fingers along the cold seam where two cut stones met. She counted 6 cameras between the sidewalk and the door and felt neither watched nor afraid, only accompanied by the memory of a day that had taught the building what it was built for. A teenage girl in a school uniform approached, notebook hugged to her chest. The bow at her collar had slipped sideways. "Judge Brooks?" she asked, cautious as if approaching a sleeping animal. I wrote you a letter. I didn't know where to send it." "Right here is good," Kiana said, and the girl exhaled like she'd been holding a question underwater. "How do you know if you're right?" the girl asked, and the question was both about law and not at all about law. "You don't," Kiana said. "You know if you're careful. You know if you're honest. You know if you invited other minds to test yours. The word right is what we say afterward if we did all 3. The girl nodded with the gravity of someone accepting homework that is also a life. Back inside, the docket didn't wait for ceremony. The conviction integrity docket took the morning. Rosa Villalobos returned with a folder thicker than her Bible. Internal Affairs had corroborated what she'd said 13 summers ago. A letter of apology from the department lay on top, signed in ink, not stamped. "It's too late for my husband to see it," she said quietly. "But it isn't too late for me." Kiana signed an order forwarding the file to the civil unit with a note. "Fast-track settlement. Some delays can be honored only by refusing to repeat them." In the afternoon, a routine suppression hearing became a small seminar. A rookie prosecutor stumbled over Terry and looked like a person dropping plates. Kiana steadied the proceeding with questions that taught without undressing. In the back row, Tessa Lynn, now a staff attorney, smiled into her notes of the elegance of an explanation that lands. Between calendars, Kiana met with a working group. Union reps, public defenders, the DA's office, community members who had learned to speak in bullet points. They hammered at an early warning system that flagged not just complaints, but patterns. Too many arrests with the same escalation language. Too many dismissals out of one squad. Off-shift text patterns that smelled like instructions. No one got to win. Everyone had to learn. They adjourned with assignments and a date. Accountability without meetings is a sermon. With meetings, it becomes a plan. An email arrived mid-evening from a police academy director 2 counties over. He wanted permission to borrow the bias interruption module, said he'd heard it wasn't preachy, which is how men who fear sermons ask for help. She said yes with conditions, measure outcomes, not feelings, invite defense counsel once a quarter to sit in, publish a curriculum. At home, the bruise had faded to a ghost you could only see if you knew where it had lived. She slept without dreaming most nights now. On a few, she woke with the remembered sensation of a baton and lay still, naming the ceiling paint color until the edge dulled. Linen, 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 and then went back to sleep. That is a kind of victory, too. On a late Friday, when the building smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fatigue, Bailiff Green paused in Kiana's doorway. "You know," she said, "the way you say next matter, you should bottle that. It moves time." Kiana laughed, a quick, surprised sound she didn't give the room often. "If I could bottle time, Asha, I'd give it to Rosa Villalobos first." Green nodded, and for a second they let silence do what it's for. There were still mistakes. A detective forged a signature and was caught because a clerk had been trained to check that kind of thing. An officer with a spotless file lost his temper on a traffic stop and was suspended, counseled, restored, and watched like a person everyone hoped would succeed with eyes that would not let denial pass as support. A case collapsed because a witness moved to another state and couldn't be compelled. The defendant had done the harm and still walked, because the law sometimes breaks your heart on its way to being fair. They named these things without theatrics, not because they loved failure, but because they had decided they would not hide the price of being principled. A year to the day after morning the baton fell, Kiana took the long way into the building. She watched a new class of bailiffs practice announcements in an empty courtroom, trying to get the boom without the bark. She stood in the lobby and counted not cameras, but faces, fewer tight jaws, more ordinary concentration. She thought a phrase the internet loves, "No one is above the law," and decided that the better sentence is a law is above no one. Not too high to see you, Not too far to reach you. Not too proud to admit it needs work. The plaque on the steps had already earned a patina where hands touched it on the way in. A small child traced the letters with a finger, lips sounding out lie and chose with the self-importance of learning. A public defender walked by with a box of files and didn't look up because he was late. The city thrummed around the building the way a tide moves around a rock. The rock holds, but it is also shaped. In chambers, a cardboard box sat on the edge of her desk. Her clerk, Jonah, pointed at it with an eyebrow. "From a hardware store," he said, as if that were the joke. Inside lay a stack of small wooden gavels, cheap but solid, each engraved with 4 words in plain font. Be careful. Be honest. There was no note, just a receipt with no name. Paid cash. She kept one and sent the rest where they could be of use. Public defender interns, the academy director 2 counties over, a high school civics teacher who had written to say her students were obsessed with procedure in a good way. Tools, not trophies. Before the afternoon calendar, she stood alone at the window and watched a woman in a blue blazer and sneakers hustle up the steps with sheaf of motions under her arm. The woman stopped at the plaque, touched the bronze, and went inside without ceremony. Nothing thundered. The glass door sighed. Somewhere, a docket number rolled to the next line. Kiana took her robe from the back of the chair, settled it on her shoulders, and palmed the gavel whose weight she knew like the heft of a family heirloom. In the mirror, the bruise was gone, but its lesson remained. Pain is a loud teacher. Purpose is a patient one. On the bench, she looked out of the room, a geography she knew and had remapped, and said the 2 words that mean we are still trying. Next matter. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves justice, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of courage triumphing over corruption, and subscribe because justice stories like this happen every day and everyone deserves to see them. Your story could be next.